Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the StigmaCrusher here. Today I want to talk about something that's very close and personal to my heart, and that is the issue of self-stigma. And I want to start a little bit of a series about stigma. I'm going to talk about self-stigma this week, cultural stigma next week, and the following week about institutional stigma. These are the three types of stigma that I talk about when I give my talks. And they are very real types of stigma, and they affect me in different ways. They affect all of us in our daily lives, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which they affect me. And this is really personal to me because I do call myself the StigmaCrusher, and yet I find that stigma still affects me in my daily life. I haven't managed to crush it or stomp it out of my daily life yet. And that's because stigma is very insistent. It's it's like a weed, basically. You can kill it and it still grows back. It's very difficult to crush entirely and to absolutely destroy and eliminate and eradicate. And that's why I tend to think of it as crushing. So I tend to crush it, but it doesn't go away. If I lift up my foot from crushing it, it will still grow back, and I have to crush it again. And so that's why I think of myself as a stigma crusher and not as the stigma eradicator and completely remover, because I find that stigma does still manage to take hold sometimes, and I have to crush it again and again and again. And that has never been more real to me than in my own life, where self-stigma still manages to take hold. So I can tell you, first of all, what self-stigma is. Self-stigma is what happens when you take that stigma that is existing in our society, that stigma that tells you that people with mental illness are stupid and lazy and just sucks on the system waiting for their next disability check, that can't do anything right, that might be, not possibly available to do their work properly, that can't be trusted with the good meaty files because they might just, go off on long-term disability any moment now. They shouldn't, for their own mental health, they shouldn't possibly be trusted with the good files. It tells you all of these things about people with mental illness, that they're potentially violent at any given time. They could just crack. It tells you all of these things about people with mental illness. And it's when you take all of those things that society and our institutions tell us about mental illness and people with mental illness, and you put them in your own brain and you stuff them deep, deep down inside you, and you truly believe that they apply to your own self. And then what happens with me at least, and I believe what happens with many, many people, is that you end up putting on this mask, this really finely tuned mask. We all have one, right? Where it's the mask that you put on when you go out in the world and you try to convince the rest of the world that you're a complete human. You're a fully fledged and adult human that's ready to take on the world, that you can do anything. It's that mask that you put on that tells people that you're ready to take on any challenges, when inside you're actually reeling. You feel like you're a mess. You feel like you're a fraud. You feel like you're an imposter. And you feel like you don't actually belong in that real world. You don't actually belong in that adult, ready to take on the world type world. You're just trying to convince everybody else that you do, when you believe, in your heart that you don't actually belong there. You're just trying to convince everyone else that you do, when really you're an imposter. And that's what self-stigma makes you do, because you know that you really are that stupid, lazy suck on the system that's potentially violent, that shouldn't be trusted with the good files at work, that shouldn't be trusted with caring for children, that shouldn't be trusted with caring for older adults, that shouldn't be trusted with caring for yourself practically. And that you really shouldn't be trusted with adult tasks, because you are that stigma that the world presents to you as the truth about people with mental illness. You believe that you must be that because you have mental illness. And that's what self-stigma does to me sometimes. It makes me believe that I am that stigma, and that I can't possibly be a functioning human, and that I'm just an imposter in the world, trying to go about the motions, trying to make people believe that I really belong there when I don't. And it's absolutely exhausting, trying to make people believe that you are this imposter, that you are this person that you really believe that you're not. And it truly is exhausting, and it's soul destroying in and of itself. It's actually worse than living with the mental illness itself. So there's the waking up and hardly being able to get out of bed. That's bad. But believing that you're not a worthwhile human being, that's worse. And that's what the stigma against mental illness really makes you believe, because it's the stigma against mental illness, while it's improving with awareness campaigns, while it's improving with the way that we are treating people with mental illness more humanely in this world, it's not improving fast enough. It's not improving with large enough strides. And we still do see someone, for example, talking to themselves on the side of the road, slightly unkempt, sitting on the road, rocking, for example, and talking to themselves. And we cross to the other side for fear of our safety, because that person could, you never know, they could crack, they could potentially be violent, they could reach out and grab you. You just never know. That's the stigma, right? And even though I'm not myself sitting on the side of that road, I believe that I could just be a step away from it, because that's what the stigma tells me, that I could be potentially violent, that I could be potentially dangerous, that I could be potentially a step away from cracking, as they say. And so that stigma is not changing fast enough. It's not changing large enough. It's not, the strides aren't big enough. And so that stigma is still with us, and it's still affecting us even to this day. And I'm wondering if some of you watching this video are nodding along with me, saying, yes, I felt that, maybe to a lesser degree, or maybe to a more of a degree even than I felt it. But that you felt that stigma, that that when you go to walk into your therapist's office, or your psychiatrist or your psychologist's office, that kind of look over your shoulder to make sure nobody's watching, to make sure nobody knows that you're going in. Because there's two kind of types of stigma. There's discredited and discreditable. Discredited stigma is when people actually would know that you have mental illness, because they can tell, because of your behaviors, or because some kind of attribute that you have. So for example, if there's a certain way of talking that maybe goes along with psychosis, so there could be a stilted way of talking that goes along with psychosis, that if you have that way of talking, someone might know that you have that disorder. Or if there's a telltale smell of alcohol, for example, if you have alcohol use or abuse disorder, or if you have behaviors such as checking with obsessive compulsive disorder, or if you, for example, with my disorder, with bipolar disorder, if I present with a mania and I'm talking too fast and I'm too overly excitable, someone might be able to tell that I have mania, and therefore be able to tell that I have bipolar disorder. Then they know from your behavior or from some attribute that you have it. You can't hide it. But a lot of people with mental illness can present very quote unquote normal, like present as though they don't have an illness. You can hide it. You can present as though you do not have an illness until someone sees you either take medication, or someone sees you go into a psychiatrist or psychologist's office, or someone finds out from something you've written or something you've said or something you've posted online. And so that's the discreditable type of stigma. And so you might find yourself, if you don't have that discredited, so if you're not already, if someone can't already tell that you have mental illness, if you're in that discreditable kind of category, you might find yourself looking over your shoulder, or taking your medication very secretively, or being very secretive about who you tell, or when you discuss your mental illness, or who you would give a doctor's note to, or something like that. You might find yourself not telling anyone at work, or being very careful about telling only your manager, and making sure that that's very secretive, because you don't want anyone to find out, so that you don't have the stigma, the weight of the stigma come down on you. But even if that stigma isn't coming down on you from outside, the self-stigma is still coming down on you from inside. And that's the danger of self-stigma. It's inside of you. You can't get away from it. And you still walk around with that imposter syndrome and that feeling like you don't belong in the world because you still firmly believe that you are that cultural stigma turned inward. And that's the real danger of self-stigma. And so I find that the best way to beat self-stigma is to crush it with understanding people, with being able to share the self-stigma, being able to share it, to talk about it outwardly. And that might seem like a contradiction in terms. Is how do you get rid of stigma? Is to make more stigma, to make more people know that you have mental illness and therefore make more stigma? Well, no, to make sure that you share it in a safe space. So in a space that is safe for sharing with people who are safe for sharing it with, that you know will understand you and support you. And if you're able to share that experience with other people and get the support from them, so you get the understanding that you aren't a waste of space, that they know that you aren't that stupid, lazy suck on the system, and get that reinforcement and that reassurance from outside that there are people out there that don't believe in that don't buy into that cultural stigma, that don't buy into that institutional stigma, that don't think, that don't reinforce what's going on inside of you. That's one of the best ways to stamp out and to crush the internal self-stigma. So it's to share your experiences outwardly with people who will understand, but make sure it's a safe space. Don't just share indiscriminately, especially if you're really heavily self-stigmatizing at the time. If you share with someone and it's not a safe space, that can make it worse. So make sure you find people who are safe to share it with. Another way is to hear messages from the internet, from books, from movies that are against that cultural stigma. So to fight the cultural stigma, and that will help you to fight the self-stigma. So watching these videos, for example, that I put out might help you to fight your cultural stigma and your self-stigma. Reading all of the types of videos and reading the messages that came out in support of World Mental Health Day. There were a variety of messages that came out, people talking about their experiences with mental health and mental illness and self-stigma and just stigma in general. And reading those kinds of uplifting messages where people did manage to crush the stigma. Those things can help you to crush your own stigma. So those kinds of messages would be helpful in crushing self-stigma. But whatever you do, don't buy into it. Don't sink into that cultural stigma and that self-stigma. Try your best not to buy into the imposter syndrome, and do your best to try to externalize and make sure that you do try to talk to somebody about what you're feeling, whether that's your therapist or somebody else that you can trust. So that's what I wanted to reflect on today. Next week, I'm going to reflect a little bit more on cultural stigma. So please do tune in for that. We'll talk a little bit about the cultural stigma around Halloween as well, and those costumes that you might be seeing this time of year, about insane asylum patient costumes and insane asylum nurse costumes, and all those things that somehow our culture thinks is appropriate this time of year. We'll talk a little bit about that, so please do tune in for that. Take care of yourselves this week, and if you are self-stigmatizing, remember, you are not a stupid, lazy suck on the system. You are worthwhile, and I will see you in my next one. Take care. Bye.
StigmaCrusher.